It's very obvious, this is a very, very big message, it's a very obvious message, but the financial crisis has and will have gender-specific impacts. And I think what we're trying to do at the bank, and the message to the bank as well as to everybody else, is that the effective policy responses should build on women's roles as economic agents. So not as vulnerable victims of the crisis, but as economic agents. And why? Let's see the impacts of the crisis. We have distinguished two kinds of impacts, first round impacts and second round impacts. The first round impacts, and as Rania was already saying, the causes are first the drop in aggregate demand exports, the tightened credit markets, the drop in remittances, all added to the food price shocks that already were happening, has two kinds of impacts. The first impact is loss of employment, and it's a first round of impact. Women, particularly those working in global export industries, have lost employment, are losing employment. And the second important impact is the fall in microfinance lending resources. We know that women are the main recipients, clients of microfinance. And all this will yield a drop in household income and an increased risk of poverty of households. And the third impact is really a second round impact. What are the vulnerable households' coping strategies to this drop in household income? So, in terms of the first impact, women workers in export industries are losing jobs. They're losing jobs, jobs are being shed, they're reducing work hours. I think, this evidence is accumulating, and here is just some examples of what has happened. In Malaysia, 78% of the workforce in the garment industry is female. Once you start reducing exports of garments, females are losing jobs. And the same thing with high-value export agriculture. In many countries, women are sort of the people who pick flowers, who are involved in high-value export agriculture. They're going to be losing jobs. And the tightened credit markets obviously are affecting men more so than women in formal financial markets, because men have the most access to formal credit, but in the microfinance institutions, clearly women are going to be most affected. In 2006, over 3,000 microfinanced institutions reached 133 million clients, and 93 million clients were the poorest when they took their first loan, and 85% of these clients were women. So the drop in remittances, again, is going to affect women and household earnings. The growth rate in remittances has dropped significantly, particularly in countries who had very important, where remittances are very important for household income. The estimate right now, I think, is that remittances on average are going to be dropping 5% to 8%. So that will really impact household earnings, particularly female earnings, especially those women who are receiving remittances from men, or when they are remitting themselves, they're going to be losing the jobs, and therefore are not going to be able to remit. Now, what are the household coping strategies? And this we know from past crises. We don't have yet evidence for this crisis, but many crises, and starting with the Great Depression in the United States, the crisis in the 80s in Latin America, in the East Asian countries in the 90s. What happens when households have drops in household earnings? One very typical response is they send their women to work. So, and this is what is called the added worker effect, but it happened here in Argentina. The red is women going back to work. In Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico in the 80s, look how much, and the yellow is men. So many in these countries reduce their participation in the workforce while females increase the participation. The same in the East Asian crisis. The only country where both men and women reduced their participation in the workforce was South Korea. But in Indonesia and the Philippines, the same effect of the added worker effect. Another household coping strategy is pulling girls and boys actually out of school. This happens more so in low-income countries than in middle-income countries. In Madagascar, with a fall in agricultural income, girls were more likely to drop out of school. In Cote d'Ivoire, however, enrollment decreased more for boys than for girls. So it's very important that we realize that the negative effects by gender can affect boys as well as girls. However, in some middle-income countries with much larger social support systems, formal social support systems, girls' attendance to school girls and boys' attendance to school had no big impact. But this is another coping strategy, and here we do have significant gender differences, and this is what is very worrisome. When households cut back on health investments, and this affects girls disproportionately more so than boys. This is a detrended GDP. This is based on 65 or so countries' data. This is when countries are growing, and this is recession times. And this is infant mortality rates. And this is infant mortality rates of girls, and the blue is boys. And you're seeing that when countries are doing better, kids, both boys and girls, do better in terms of nutritional status, or infant mortality rates, that is even, infant mortality rates for both sexes decrease. When countries are doing badly, look at the huge difference. Many more girls than boys die. So this is really, there's a very strong gender differential there in terms of the effects. So what are the policy implications? A priority investment, 5 minutes, is to increase women's incomes in poor households when under crisis conditions. And why? Because a drop in female earnings has an effect in terms of current poverty reduction and economic growth, and also in terms of future poverty reduction and economic growth, because a drop in female earnings affects households not only through the direct effects on earnings, but also affects households through the impact on child well-being, on the well-being of children. So it's the double whammy if women get a drop in their earnings.